October 4, 1957. The first artificial satellite, or artificial moon, was launched the night of Friday, October 4th, 1957. The satellite and launch vehicle had been on the pad for 2 days when Sergei Korolev gave the order to fire. The complex pedal structure surrounding the rocket opened perfectly. Its long stabilizing arms swung up and back by counterweights. Engineers and technicians streamed from the pad as various tasks were done until the rocket stood alone in the cold night. The oxidizer tanks were topped off. 5 minutes before liftoff, a warning light reported a malfunction in the oxidizer loading system. After a hasty conference, Korolev ordered the warning overridden. At 10:28 p.m. Moscow time, the R7 thundered into the sky. This marks the triumph and exploration dreamed of by humanity for thousands of years. Ideas of space travel in antiquity. For thousands of years, humanity did not have a clear idea of the structure of planet Earth and its surrounding environment. The region above the Earth was not thought of as outer space, but rather as the heavens and the abode of the gods. Ideas about space travel were rather quaint. The Chinese in the 16th century were familiar with the use of gunpowder. In particular, it was used in fireworks and rockets. Legend has it that in the early 1500s, Chinese official Wan Hu attempted to use rockets to fly. He mounted 47 rockets to the bottom of a chair and ignited them. When the smoke cleared, there was no sign of Wan Hu or the chair. In 2004, the show Mythbusters attempted to recreate Wan Hu's experiment and had similar results. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that manned rocket flight is risky and potentially deadly. Early science fiction. Johann Kepler, the 17th century astronomer who first accurately described the shape of planetary orbits, wrote Somnium, or The Dream. In this work, he describes what a traveler would see when standing on the surface of the moon: sunrises, sunsets, and the view of the Earth in the lunar sky. Part of Kepler's motivation was to increase support for the then controversial heliocentric theory. The French author Jules Verne wrote a number of fictional books which foresaw many of the developments of the 20th century, such as airplanes, automobiles, and television. Of particular note is his 1865 From the Earth to the Moon. It describes a journey to the moon aboard a ship which was fired from a cannon. This story was the inspiration for the Georges Méliès 1902 silent film Le Voyage dans la Lune, in English, A Trip to the Moon. English writer H.G. Wells wrote a number of books with space-related themes. The most prominent is probably War of the Worlds, in which an army of Martians invade turn-of-the-century England. This book inspired a number of 20th century astronomers and engineers, including U.S. rocket pioneer Robert Goddard. Wells also wrote The First Men in the Moon, which described another manned mission to the moon. It was made into a movie in 1964. Another silent movie of particular note is the 1929 Fritz Lang Frau im Mond, or Woman in the Moon. The German rocket scientist Hermann Oberth gave technical advice. The story centers on a love triangle between travelers to the moon, where a breathable atmosphere and gold are found. Of more importance is the fact that the rocket shown in the movie is rather realistic, somewhat resembling the then-future V-2. This movie is also credited with having the first on-screen countdown to launch. The character of Buck Rogers first appeared in the August 1928 Amazing Stories in Anthony Rogers' story Armageddon 2419 AD. The futuristic Buck Rogers was popularized in radio shows, movie serials, and a number of TV shows. Flash Gordon started his career in a comic strip by Alex Raymond, which was first printed on January 7, 1934. Flash, along with his colleagues Dr. Hans Zarkov and Dale Arden, travel from planet to planet encountering different civilizations, a formula adopted in later science fiction series. This popular storyline also had a long run in movie and movie serials. In fact, the start of the Star Wars movies, with the introductory sentences which roll off to the horizon, is an homage to the Flash Gordon serials. 3 engineers in 3 countries: Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth. The first 3 decades of the 20th century saw the development of 3 independent rocket programs. One primarily theoretical in Russia and the Soviet Union by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Another in the United States by theoretician and engineer Robert Goddard. And a third, also primarily theoretical, in Germany by Homan Oberth. Konstantin Edvardovich Tsiolkovsky was a poor, almost deaf math teacher in rural Russia. He wrote about the possibility of an artificial satellite in 1895 and further described spaceflight in articles published in 1903 and 1911. Using Newtonian mechanics, he calculated the speed necessary to keep a satellite at a given altitude in orbit. In the 1903 work, he stated his rocket equation: U equals V times the natural log of m sub 0 divided by m plus u sub 0, where u is the final rocket velocity, v is the velocity of the exhaust gases, m sub 0 and m are the starting and ending masses of the rocket, and u sub 0 is the initial rocket velocity prior to the fuel burning. Tsiolkovsky designed hypothetical space stations and the idea of a multi-stage rocket, which he called a rocket train. His work was not widely circulated until after the Russian Revolution. The communist government, wanting to portray itself as technologically progressive, was very supportive of his work. In 1921, he was given a lifetime pension. The Soviet government paid for the publication of 50 of Tsiolkovsky's articles and books. He died in 1935. Robert Goddard was born in 1882 in Worcester, Massachusetts. He earned a bachelor's degree in physics from Worcester Polytechnic University and a PhD in physics from Clark University. He performed his first rocket experiments before the First World War. He worked at Princeton University and received 2 important patents on solid fuel rockets in 1914. The U.S. Army expressed some interest in his work, but after the end of the First World War, the interest dissipated. Nonetheless, Goddard continued his experiments, next concentrating on liquid fuel rockets. His first launch of a liquid-fueled rocket occurred March 16, 1926 in Auburn, Massachusetts. The rocket was 10 feet tall and weighed 10 pounds. It reached a humble height of 40 feet. A 1926 New York Times editorial belittled Goddard's work and his dream of launching rockets into space and to the moon. Following that experience, Goddard continued his work but was reluctant to share or publicize the results. He continued quietly working during the 1930s and was eventually able to launch and control some of the most successful rockets in the world at the time. On the verge of World War II in 1940, Goddard approached the U.S. military and offered to share his rocket research results. The offer was declined. This was not the attitude shared by the military of certain European countries of the time. During the Second World War, Goddard worked for the Navy on jet-assisted takeoff rocket boosters. He died of throat cancer on August 10, 1945. Today, Robert Goddard is recognized as the father of American rocketry and space travel. Hermann Oberth was born in 1894 in Transylvania. He studied physics and, in 1922, submitted his thesis on rocketry to the University of Heidelberg. The thesis was rejected because rocketry was thought to be a fringe topic. Oberth turned the work into a popular book called The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. This was the first technical book on space travel to become popular in the general public. In fact, Oberth was the technical advisor on the classic 1929 Fritz Lang science fiction movie, The Woman in the Moon. Oberth did his own experiments with liquid fuel rockets in the 1930s, unaware of Goddard's work. His work involved students from the Technical University of Berlin, including Verner von Braun. Unlike Tsiolkovsky and Goddard, Oberth lived to see the launching of Earth satellites. In fact, he lived to see man walk on the moon, the launch of the space shuttle, spacecraft land on Venus and Mars, and probes sent to all 8 planets. He died in Germany in December 1989. Verner von Braun and the V2. Probably the most influential person in the development of rocketry in the 20th century was Verner von Braun. He attended the Technical University in Berlin, received an engineering degree in 1932, and a PhD in physics in 1934. The 1930s saw a proliferation of amateur rocket societies. Such societies were formed in the Soviet Union, Britain, the U.S., and Germany. The German organization was named Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or the Society of Space Travel. Von Braun became active in the society and was heavily influenced by Hermann Oberth. The Nazi Germany government became interested in the work done by the society. A research center was set up on the Baltic coast of Germany near the town of Peenemünde, where von Braun worked for several years. In fact, Hermann Oberth worked there for a while as well. The facts that slave labor was used in rocket construction at Peenemünde and that the facility was used to develop weapons used primarily against London followed von Braun for the rest of his life. The infamous V2 rocket was the climax of research at Peenemünde. The V2 was 46 feet tall and weighed 28,000 pounds when completely fueled. It ran on ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen. It was guided by gyroscopes to its target and carried a 1-ton warhead. The engines burned for 68 seconds, giving the V2 a range of 200 miles and a top speed of 3,600 miles per hour. More than 3,000 V2s were launched during World War II. Only 44% of them landed within 3 miles of their target. Though effective in terrorizing the populations of London and Antwerp, Belgium, the V2 was an expensive and rather impractical weapon. As the Second World War was winding down in Germany, the Peenemünde team traveled south to avoid capture by the Soviets. On May 2, 1945, the team surrendered to U.S. forces. The U.S. Army was able to obtain paperwork, spare parts, and a number of V2 rockets. These personnel and equipment were to become the foundation of the U.S. rocket program. The Soviet Union also captured some Peenemünde workers and hardware, but not nearly to the extent that the U.S. did. 1950s popular culture, books and magazines. Probably the most significant nonfiction works to grab the public imagination concerning spaceflight and spacecraft were a series of books and Collier's magazine articles, which appeared between 1949 and 1956. The first was the magnificent Conquest of Space, which was first published in 1949. It described the launching of satellites and people into space and gave a detailed description of a manned moon mission. Each of the planets of the solar system were described with up-to-date knowledge of the time. The text was written by Willy Ley and the paintings were by Chesley Bonestell. Several of Bonestell's illustrations, particularly those of the lunar surface, were so detailed that they were mistaken for photographs by some. In addition to a number of reprints of Conquest of Space, 3 other books followed, which were of similar content. In 1952, Across the Space Frontier was published. It contained articles by Verner von Braun, Willy Ley, and the noted astronomer Fred Whipple. In 1953, Conquest of the Moon appeared. It contained ideas concerning travel to the moon, really an expanded version of one of the chapters of Conquest of Space. A more ambitious project was described in the 1956 Exploration of Mars, also by Willy Ley and Verner von Braun. The history of our knowledge of Mars was given, followed by a realistic description of a manned mission to Mars, again illustrated by Chesley Bonestell. Also, during the early 1950s, a series of 8 articles appeared in the widely circulated Collier's magazine. Most of these articles were either written by von Braun and Ley or written in consultation with them. Part of the motivation for von Braun in undertaking these writing projects was to generate public interest and excitement in space travel. After all, if space travel was to be funded by the government of the U.S., then there would have to be a high degree of public support. This motivation was clear in the editorial comment of the first issue of the series titled, "Man Will Conquer Space Soon." This issue appeared March 22, 1952, and the editorial stated, "What you will read is not science fiction. It is serious fact. Moreover, it is an urgent warning that the U.S. must immediately embark on a long-range development program to secure for the West space superiority. If we do not, somebody else will. That somebody else, very probably, would be the Soviet Union." 7 more issues followed with space-related articles. Topics covered included Man on the Moon, and a description of a proposal for the first man-made satellite called the Baby Space Station. Other issues dealt with space emergencies, and the final issue of April 30th, 1954, dealt with Mars. As with the books on these topics, the articles were accompanied by illustrations by Chesley Bonestell. 1950s popular culture, TV. The new medium of television saw a number of space-related fantasy shows in the 1950s. Captain Video, Rocky Jones, Buck Rogers, and Flash Gordon. In order to promote his amusement park, Walt Disney started the TV show Disneyland in 1954, later renamed The Wonderful World of Disney. As part of the Tomorrowland motif, Disney collaborated with von Braun in the creation of 3 shows dealing with space travel. Disney referred to the shows as science factual, as opposed to science fiction. The first show, Man in Space, aired March 9, 1955, and included commentary by Heinz Haber, Verner von Braun, and Willy Ley. In the show, von Braun describes a 4-stage rocket that would carry people into space. The Disney animators then provide a cartoon version of the launch and entry into space. On December 28, 1955, Man in the Moon aired. It included animated history of our ideas about the moon and a fictional but dramatic real-life journey to the moon. Mars and Beyond aired December 4, 1957, 2 months to the day after the launch of Sputnik. The show starts with Walt Disney talking with robot Garco. A manned mission to Mars is described and accompanied with animation. The mission is launched from a giant wheel-shaped space station, an idea of von Braun's. The show includes descriptions of all of the planets and concentrates on speculations about life on Mars. Another part of popular culture was also swept up in the speculations of Disney and von Braun: comic books. Dell Comics published books outlining many of the ideas presented in the Disneyland shows, and updating things a bit to include the actual rockets developed during the 50s. 1950s popular culture. Movies. The 1950s saw a huge number of movies based on space travel, flying saucers, and space aliens. These movies built on and added to the public's interest in real space travel. Some of these movies were surprisingly well thought out. Others, not so much so. The most insightful and thoughtful of these, in my opinion, is George Powell's 1950 Destination Moon. It describes a realistic journey to the moon. Influenced by the knowledge of the time, the spaceship looked very similar to a giant V-2. The physics of the movie is basically correct. The art of Chesley Bonestell was used for many of the shots, especially for the long shots of the surface of the moon. As an example of the good science in the movie, there is no sound in space because it's a vacuum. Destination Moon accurately reflects this, unlike the vast majority of space movies produced today. One interesting thing about the movie is that it has a brief 4-minute lecture on physics and Newtonian mechanics. The producers of the movie went for one of the top celebrities of the day to explain this material, Woody Woodpecker. Whereas Destination Moon was a high-budget, well-advertised film, Rocket Ship XM was lower budget and far less technically accurate. It involves a trip to the moon which goes astray and ends up at Mars. There is a human society on Mars, crew members are killed, and the ship returns to the Earth only to crash, killing the pair of characters in the love sub-story which was common in 1950s science fiction. One of the best of 1950s space genre science fiction films is The Day the Earth Stood Still. Though the movie makes use of a very human space alien and a human-shaped robot, Gort, who arrives in a culturally new flying saucer, the orbital mechanics described by the character Professor Barnard are accurate, even though very technical. There is an overall anti-war or peace sentiment to the film. Paramount Pictures' 1953 War of the Worlds was the first big-screen adaptation of H.G. Wells' book. Though not reflective of realistic space travel of the 1950s, the movie is a classic and certainly generated public interest in space and rocket travel. The movie marks a continuing fascination with the planet Mars. We are here to commemorate an event of October 1957, but there was another relevant well-known event of another October. 69 years ago, on October 30th, 1938, a young Orson Welles broadcast a radio play of War of the Worlds, convincing a number of people that the events were real, and, incidentally, ending up testifying before irritated public officials. Mars Mania today is as great as ever, with new movie versions of War of the Worlds still coming out, not to mention the extraordinary success of recent NASA probes to Mars. The book by Willy Ley was made into a movie in 1955. The film version of Conquest of Space was a story about a manned mission to Mars, which was launched from a wheel-shaped space station. The technical details are not bad, at least when measured against the knowledge of Mars in the 1950s. The influence of von Braun's ideas as expressed in the Collier's magazine articles is clear. The 1950s saw a proliferation of space-related movies, some better than others, some with an educational component, and many that were just fun. Korolev the R7 and Sputnik. The identity of the chief designer of the Soviet rocket program remained a secret until after his death in 1966. Though the details of his death are unclear, the Soviet paper Pravda printed the obituary of Sergei Korolev a few days after his death. His accomplishments in the development of the rockets used in the early Soviet satellite and manned programs were described, and Korolev was given a state funeral. In 1934, Korolev published Rocket Flight in the Stratosphere. He spent the 1930s on rocket work for the military, but was convicted of subversion in 1938 and spent 6 years in a Soviet gulag. Following the war, he was involved in research on captured German V-2s. The Soviet rocket team developed what would become the workhorse of the Soviet space program, the R7 rocket. The R7 was developed as an intercontinental ballistic missile, but its primary, and almost exclusive, use would be for launching satellites. The R7, which launched the first artificial satellite, was 92 feet tall. Instead of having different stages mounted on top of each other, there were 4 strap-on boosters mounted to the lower part of the rocket. At liftoff, the rocket weighed 591,000 pounds. These details were not made public until years later. In fact, the first time the Soviet Union released images of an R-7 rocket was when one was put on display at the 1967 Paris Air Show. On August 30, 1955, the Soviet Academy of Sciences recommended the launching of an artificial satellite. The Soviets were aware of American attempts and failures in the launching of rockets. They designed a simple 184-pound satellite, which they referred to as PS-1, for Prostyshy Sputnik. The main body of Sputnik was a shiny metal sphere about 2 feet in diameter. It had 4 long antennas, 2 8 feet long and 2 9.5 feet long. The antennas were spring-loaded and whipped out when the shroud covering them was ejected. Sputnik had 2 radio transmitters and instruments to measure temperature and pressure within the satellite. Over half of the weight of the satellite was due to the batteries which powered it. As described in the introduction, Sputnik 1 was launched on the evening of October 4, 1957, aboard an R-7 rocket. Its orbit was at an angle of 65 degrees to the Earth's equator. At the low point in its orbit, the perigee, it was at an altitude of 141 miles, and at the high point, or apogee, it was at 587 miles. It took 96 minutes for Sputnik to orbit the Earth. One of the transmitters sent out a sequence of beeps at a frequency easily heard by amateur radio operators. Life magazine described the transmissions in their October 14, 1957 issue as an eerie intermittent croak. It sounded like a cricket with a cold. Was picked up by radio receivers around the world last week. It came from beyond the stratosphere and signaled an epical breakthrough into the new age of space exploration. Detection of the signal was easy and, no doubt, part of the Soviet Union's plan to let the world know of their success. The batteries of Sputnik lasted for only 3 weeks, and then the beeps stopped. Sputnik 1 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere in January 1958. The U.S. rocket program and Explorer 1. After World War II, the U.S. military took a deep interest in rocketry. Unfortunately, this led to several isolated rocket programs within the various branches of the armed forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Army Air Force, later simply the Air Force. The first proposal for a U.S. satellite was made by the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics in 1945. The so-called Earth Satellite Test Vehicle would ride on a single-stage, high-altitude test vehicle, which burned liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Funding problems, combined with the objections by the Army Air Force, which claimed that space was its domain, led to cancellation of the project in 1948. Post-war testing of rockets in the U.S. started at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The Army set this area aside as a rocket test center in July 1945, a month before the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. The first ever liquid-fueled rocket to be funded by the U.S. government was the WAC Corporal. WAC, W-A-C, stands for Without Attitude Control. The project began in November 1944, and the first launch at White Sands was on October 11, 1945. The rocket reached an altitude of 44.5 miles, a U.S. record, but less than half the altitude attainable by the V-2. The WAC Corporal was 16 feet tall, 1 foot in diameter, and weighed 660 pounds when totally fueled. In Project Bumper, a WAC Corporal was mounted on the top of a V-2 as a second stage. On February 24, 1949, such a configuration reached an altitude of 244 miles and a speed of 5,510 miles per hour. At the time, both an altitude and speed record. In fact, there can be no argument that the second stage actually went into space. However, this launch is not considered the beginning of the space age. Project Bumper plays one other noteworthy role in U.S. space history. On July 24, 1950, a WAC V-2 Bumper combination was the first rocket launched at the Air Force's new rocket testing facility at Cape Canaveral, Florida. In all, between 1946 and 1952, the U.S. launched 63 captured V-2s. Some carried cameras, weather instruments, and cosmic ray detectors. 4 launches carried monkeys. None survived their flights. These rockets routinely reached altitudes of around 100 miles. With the limited supply of German V-2s, a new rocket was needed with similar capabilities. One such U.S. rocket was the Aero-B. This Navy-funded rocket was first launched in November 1947, and more than 1,000 were eventually launched. These were the main rockets used in high-altitude research in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. A larger rocket, which was rather similar to the V-2, was the Viking. This rocket incorporated knowledge learned from the V-2 experiments, but also included some advancements, in particular a sophisticated steering system and the use of rocket motors which could be swiveled. The Viking was 45 feet tall and about 3 feet in diameter. In 12 launch attempts between 1949 and 1955, there were 11 successes. The maximum altitude reached by a Viking was 158 miles. Another Army project, which was a key stepping stone in the U.S. rocketry program, was the Hermes rocket. Its engine was the immediate predecessor of the A6 engine used in the Redstone rocket. In 1948, the Army set up a new facility at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. In 1950, Redstone engineers started work on plans for a ballistic missile with a range of 300 miles. They named the rocket in honor of the arsenal. The first Redstone rocket was launched on August 20, 1953. The Redstone weighed 62,750 pounds at liftoff, was 69 feet tall, and 6 feet in diameter. It was fueled with liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol. Von Braun was the head of the Redstone project. The Redstone rocket would play a key role in the launching of the first U.S. satellite and astronaut. The International Geophysical Year ran from July 1957 to December 1958. Its purpose was to promote the study of the Earth, including the upper atmosphere. An organizing committee for the year resolved in 1954 to encourage participating countries to, quote, the launching of small satellite vehicles, close quote. The Eisenhower administration created a committee to study various options for putting up a U.S. satellite. The committee chose to go with a Navy proposal which became known as Project Vanguard. The first runner-up was an Army-Navy collaborative project consisting of the Army's Redstone rocket and the Navy's instrumentation. Some space historians have speculated that the Vanguard project was chosen because of the fact that it was a more civilian-based and less military-based proposal, with much of the work contracted out to private companies. Others have observed that the committee's objective was not necessarily to find the fastest way to get a satellite up. After all, this first space race was hardly ever publicly discussed. The Vanguard rocket consisted of 3 stages. The Vanguard satellite was about the size of a grapefruit. Following the shock in the U.S. of the launch of Sputnik, the rush was on to put up an American satellite. On December 6, 1957, the first attempt was made. The rocket rose a few feet into the air and then burst into flames. The small satellite was recovered from the wreckage and today is on display at the Air and Space Museum. Following this spectacular public failure, in the press called Flopnik and Kaputnik, the von Braun Army team was given the OK to attempt a launch in January 1958. The successful Redstone rockets had been enlarged and modified into a new rocket called the Jupiter C. Launch tests were made of the Jupiter C in 1956 and 1957. In April of 1956, Army General Bruce Medeiros claimed that the Jupiter C could put a satellite in orbit by early 1957, a goal that would have easily predated the Sputnik launch. With the public outcry following the success of Sputnik and the failure of Vanguard, the von Braun Army team got their chance. At 10:48 p.m. on January 31, 1958, the firing command was given and the United States entered the space age as the Jupiter C successfully pushed the Explorer 1 satellite into orbit. The launch panel used to put the United States' first satellite is on display at the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Explorer 1 weighed 13.9 pounds by itself, or 30.8 pounds when attached to the 4th stage of the launch vehicle, from which it never separated. It was in an orbit that ranged from an altitude of 225 miles to 1,594 miles. It carried a Geiger counter to measure radiation, 2 thermometers, a microphone to detect micrometeorite impacts, and 2 radio transmitters to report the results. The Geiger counter detected high radiation zones, which were named after one of the Explorer 1 designers, James Van Allen. By the way, another influence on popular culture of this research is present in one of the first Marvel comic books. The Fantastic Four were given their superpowers when they were irradiated in the Van Allen radiation belts. Explorer 1 revealed that near-Earth space was relatively free of debris and hence satellites would face a minimal threat from impacts. Explorer 1 functioned for about 4 months until May 23, 1958, when its batteries died. It was in orbit until 1970 when atmospheric drag caused it to burn up on re-entry. The influence of Sputnik. Though news reports from October of 1957 do not reveal an immediate panic from the Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik, eventually there became fears of a missile gap and concerns about communist missiles raining down nuclear weapons on the U.S. The simple fact that the Soviet Union, a presumably technologically backwards nation, was able to beat the United States in this achievement was a sign to many that the American educational system was failing. One reaction to Sputnik was an increase in funding for science education across all levels. But this was only the first space race. A second race involved putting people into space. This was another race won by the Soviets on April 12, 1961, when Yuri Gagarin completed one orbit of the Earth. The third race was the race for the moon. John F. Kennedy declared this a goal of the U.S. to be achieved before the end of the 1960s. The United States won this race on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon in the Apollo 11 mission. Today, our manned space missions are focused on the International Space Station. Humanity has put satellites not only around the Earth, but around Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. In addition, flyby missions have explored Uranus, Neptune, comets, and asteroids. The first launch of a satellite 50 years ago was just the beginning of exploration that is ongoing today and will continue tomorrow.